The voice she heard first was Lionel's, low and certain in the way he spoke when he believed no one who mattered was listening. The second voice stopped her hand on the doorframe. It was Ezra Reston, her husband's partner, a man she had sat across from at dinner 17 times in 3 years. Adela pressed her back against the wall of her father's hallway and did not breathe. The petition goes to the county court on Friday, Lionel was saying. Hadley will try to block it. But Hadley's old and he hasn't practiced in 8 years. He won't know which precedents to cite. The board won't like it. Reston's voice carried a note of unease she had never heard in him before, declaring a man's wife incompetent to manage. She's not managing anything. She sits in on meetings and reads ledgers. That's not management. That's sentiment. A pause. And the board doesn't need to like it. They need to sign off on it. Hargrove will, Morton will. Those two together constitute a voting majority on the transfer clause. And after the transfer? Meridian takes possession by the 1st of January. Lionel's voice did not change. It never changed when he was discussing things that mattered. The deed clears, the stock converts, and we take our distributions from the sale proceeds. Reston was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was careful. We discussed 30%, my 30%. We'll discuss it again, after closing. Adela held the wall beside the doorframe, and did not move, and did not make a sound. In another part of the house, she could hear the voices of the mill foreman and the estate attorney finishing their business in the parlor. She could hear the clock in the hallway marking 2:15. She had come to her father's study because she had always come here when she needed to think clearly. And she had come in particular today, 6 months to the day after his death, because there was a draft restructuring agreement on his desk she needed to review before Friday's board meeting. She had not expected to find the door unlatched. She had not expected any of this. Adela Moorefield, née Holbrook, was 27 years old. She had married Lionel in the autumn of 1874 at her father's careful arrangement. A joining of the Holbrook textile works with the Moorefield Capital Network, practical and correct, and entirely without warmth on either side. She had not resented the arrangement. She had respected it, and in respecting it had come to understand its terms precisely. She would bring the mill, the contracts, the Holbrook name. Lionel would bring liquidity, connections, and the ability to expand the operation northward into the Canadian wool trade. They would be useful to each other. She had believed that. Now she stood in the hallway and listened to her husband describe the timeline by which he intended to sell her father's mill to a railroad company without her knowledge, and she understood that she had confused efficiency with partnership, and that the confusion had cost her 6 months she did not have. Her father's voice came back to her, the way it always did when she needed it, clear and specific. You read a ledger before you read a man, Adela. A ledger doesn't flatter you. She pushed herself off the wall. She smoothed her skirt. She turned and walked back down the hall toward the parlor. Mr. Purvis was still there when she entered. He was 61 years old and had worked the Holbrook mill for 33 years, the last 12 as foreman, and he looked up from his conversation with the estate attorney with the particular attentiveness of a man who had known Adela since she was 9 years old, and trailing her father through the weaving room, asking questions about the looms. Mrs. Moorefield, he said. Mr. Purvis, I need a moment. She looked at the estate attorney, privately. He left without argument. The estate attorney understood that certain conversations required fewer witnesses. Purvis watched her cross the room and close the parlor door. He said nothing. He was good at that, at giving silence to people who needed to think. The restructuring agreement, Adela said. The one my father had drafted in September before he died. What did it stipulate about transfer authority? Purvis was quiet for 3 seconds. That any sale of more than 25% of the mill's holdings required written consent of the primary heir. He paused. Which would be you? And a petition to have that consent set aside. What would that require? Another pause, longer, the face of a man working through the implications of a question before he answered it. A competency hearing, 2 consenting board members, a county court judge. He looked at her steadily. Mrs. Moorefield, what's in that study? She told him. She told him plainly and without decoration, the way her father had taught her to relay material information, in order, with the relevant details, without the feelings attached to them. She told him about Lionel's voice and Reston's voice, and the Meridian Railroad, and the 1st of January, and the 30%. That was apparently no longer guaranteed. Purvis listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. She counted, and then he said, "Your father's private ledger. The one he kept separately from the mill books." "Yes. It's not in the study. I know where it is." Her father had shown her. The previous December, 2 weeks before his first heart episode, he had taken her into the mill's original counting room and shown her the floor panel under the east window and said, "I hope you never need this, but now you know it's here. I need you to get it before Lionel leaves the study, and I need you to find Judge Hadley. Hadley's in Boston until Thursday. Then we reach him in Boston." She moved to the writing desk in the corner of the parlor and sat. "I also need everything you know about Ezra Reston, every conversation you've had with him about the mill in the last 6 months, every question he's asked." Purvis straightened. "How much time do we have?" "The board meets Friday morning at 9. He nodded once. He did not offer sympathy and she did not want it. He went to get the ledger. What happened in the next 2 hours happened quietly, in the ordinary rooms of a house that contained a husband who did not know his wife, had listened at his door, a business partner who was beginning to suspect he had been lied to about the distribution terms, and one woman who had been reading her father's ledgers since she was 14 years old. Adela found the restructuring agreement she had come for and read it twice. She found the mill's insurance valuations for the previous 3 years and compared them to the figure Lionel had cited to the board in September as the mill's current estimated worth. The difference was $42,000. She noted this in her own hand on a clean sheet of paper, with the relevant document dates beside each figure, the way her father had taught her to note anything that would be used in a negotiation. Clean, specific, undeniable. Purvis returned with the ledger. He had also found, in the mill's original filing cabinet, a letter from the Meridian Railroad Company addressed to Lionel, not to the Holbrook Moorefield Partnership. The subject line read, "Transfer of deed, conditional on competency resolution." 8 weeks ago. While she had been sitting across from Lionel at dinner and reviewing weaving contracts and managing the workers' payroll schedule for November, this letter had existed. The timeline had been in motion. She put the letter with the ledger. "One more thing," she told Purvis. "There's a woman in Providence. Her name is Dulcie March. She had a small textile concern, a finishing house on the Woonasquatucket. 3 years ago it was transferred out of her control through a competency proceeding. I read about it in the trade paper. My father mentioned it." She looked at Purvis. "I want to know whether Lionel had any connection to that proceeding. And I want to reach Mrs. March before Friday." Purvis wrote the name down. He did not ask why. He was beginning to understand why. Adela went upstairs and changed into her working clothes, the ones she wore when she walked the mill floor. Then she went to find her husband. Lionel was in the drawing room when she entered, standing by the window with a glass of bourbon and the polished ease of a man who had no idea the ground had moved under him. He was 38, broad-shouldered, with the kind of handsome that worked best in public, in boardrooms, at charitable dinners, in conversations where charm was more useful than substance. She had always known the difference between those two things. She had made the mistake of believing they could coexist in a man. "The board meeting," she said, sitting across from him without preamble. "I'd like to review the agenda before Friday." He smiled at her. It was a very good smile. "Of course, I'll have Reston send the draft over tomorrow." "And the restructuring timeline?" Wendell had a framework. "The September draft. I want to make sure it's incorporated." A small shift behind the smile. "Nothing dramatic. The adjustment of a man who was very good at adjusting. We can discuss it Thursday. There are a few modifications I've been considering. I'd like to see them in writing before Thursday." She held his gaze. "I've been managing the mill accounts since September, Lionel. I know what the framework says. I'd simply like to ensure the board is working from current documentation." He agreed. He said it pleasantly. He had no reason yet to think she knew anything. She went back to the counting room and kept working. Judge Hadley arrived on Thursday evening. He came directly from the train station to the mill, which told Adela that Purvis had communicated the urgency correctly. Hadley was 70 years old, had practiced law for 42 of them, and had been her father's attorney and friend for the last 15. He sat in the counting room and read the ledger and the Meridian letter and Adela's comparative document, with the methodical attention of a man who had read a great many documents that people had not wanted read. When he finished, he said, "A competency petition with 2 consenting board members would give them a 3-week window to execute the transfer before it could be formally contested." "I know." Hargrove and Morton, you believe they're already committed? Based on what Lionel told Reston, yes. Hadley set the documents down. Then the question is what we do at Friday's meeting. I know what I'm going to do, Adela said. I need you in that room. He looked at her for a moment over his reading glasses. Your father said once, he told me this approximately 3 years ago, at dinner, after your first year running the accounts, that you were the most thorough person he had ever known, that you didn't miss things because you were constitutionally incapable of letting things go unexamined. He paused. I think he was right. Can you be there Friday? I'll be there. She found Ezra Reston at 7:30 that same evening, waiting on the steps of the mill office. He had been there, Purvis told her afterward, for 40 minutes before she came out. The posture of a man who had been working himself up to something and needed the time. Adela looked at him in the November cold and said nothing. He told me 30%, Reston said. Last week he told me he was still working out the allocation. Now I can't reach him, and his secretary says the closing documents are already drafted. He looked at her. His face was doing something complicated and not entirely comfortable. He's going to cut me out, isn't he? Almost certainly, Adela said. You were useful while the arrangement needed a second party. Now it doesn't. Reston's jaw tightened. I didn't know he was going to sell the mill entirely. He told me we were restructuring the ownership share, bringing in railroad capital as a minority investor. Did you believe him? A pause. I wanted to. Adela looked at him for a long moment. The cold air was very still around them. Behind her, the mill was quiet at this hour. Only the night watchman's lamp visible in the east window. I want your full account, she said, in writing, signed, with dates. Every conversation, every document he showed you, every figure he cited, everything. She paused. And I want to know, at any point in the last 8 months, did you hear the name Meridian Railroad mentioned in connection with any other textile property in this region? Reston blinked. There was something. A deal that fell through in Providence, 3 years back. He mentioned it once as an example. He said it was an example of how these arrangements could go wrong without proper legal structure. Providence, 3 years, a deal that fell through. It didn't fall through for Meridian, she thought. It fell through for the woman who owned the property. Come inside, she said. I have paper. Reston came inside. The Holbrook Mill board meeting convened at 9 o'clock on Friday morning in the second-floor conference room, with 6 board members present. Hargrove, Morton, 2 senior mill investors who had worked with Wendell since the beginning, and 1 woman who had been taking her father's minutes in that room since she was 19 years old. Lionel arrived at 9:15. He came in smiling, shook hands, settled into the chair at the head of the table as if it belonged to him, which it did not. He saw Adela in her usual seat across from him and gave her the smile that meant good. You're here. This will look better with you present. He saw Judge Hadley a moment later and the smile held, but just barely. Adela, he said. I wasn't aware Judge Hadley would be attending. He's advising on the restructuring documentation, she said. As my father's original legal counsel, it seemed appropriate. Lionel looked at Hadley. Hadley looked back. Neither of them said anything useful. The meeting began. When the agenda reached the restructuring proposal, Lionel presented it with the practiced ease she had watched him apply to everything. Confident, specific, reasonable sounding. The petition language was buried in the 4th item of a 7-item proposal. Hargrove and Morton had their pens out before the paragraph was fully read aloud. Before we proceed to signatures, Adela said. The room went quiet. She set her father's private ledger on the table. Beside it, the Meridian letter. Beside that, the comparative valuation document in her own handwriting. The restructuring proposal as written represents the mill's current value at $42,000 below its insured valuation, she said. Her voice was even, her father's voice. The discrepancy appears across 3 separate years of assessment documents, which I've included for reference. She looked at Hargrove and Morton. I'd like to give both of you the opportunity to review the actual figures before signing anything that reduces your own investment's value by a corresponding proportion. Hargrove looked at the ledger, then at Lionel, then back at the ledger. There is also, Adela said, a letter from the Meridian Railroad Company addressed to my husband personally, dated 8 weeks ago, discussing the transfer of this mill's deed as conditional on the resolution of a competency proceeding. She slid the letter to the center of the table. I am not aware of having been found incompetent by any court in this county. but it appears the process of arranging that finding has been underway for some time." The silence that followed was absolute. Lionel said very quietly and very controlled, "That letter has been taken out of context." "Judge Hadley," Adela said without looking at her husband, "can you confirm for the board whether a competency petition filed with 2 consenting board members, as outlined in item 4 of this proposal, would constitute a legally binding basis for transferring deed authority without the primary heir's written consent?" Hadley spoke with the measured precision of a man who had rehearsed this answer since Thursday evening. He cited the relevant statutes. He was not brief. He was thorough. He was 70 years old and had spent 42 years being thorough, and every board member in that room understood by the end of it exactly what they had almost signed. Morton put down his pen. Hargrove pushed the proposal back toward the center of the table. Lionel's composure held. She would give him that. It held the way composure holds when a man is still calculating, still looking for the angle. He looked at her across the table with the expression of a person reassessing everything they had assumed, very quickly, under pressure. "You want to discuss this privately," he said. "No," Adela said. "Everything that needs to be said about the Holbrook Mill belongs in this room with these witnesses." She held his gaze, including Mr. Reston's account of the arrangement as he understood it, which Judge Hadley has in writing, signed and dated. Lionel went still. She watched him understand that Reston had been in the counting room Thursday evening. She watched him understand what that meant for the timeline. She watched him perform, very rapidly, the calculation that men like him always performed. The accounting of who knew what, and whether the number of people who knew was already beyond the point of containment. It was. He picked up his hat, he stood, he left the room without a word, without looking back, without the smile. The sound of 6 board members collectively exhaling was the quietest thing Adela had heard all week. Dulcie March arrived from Providence 2 days later. She came because Purvis had reached her through a textile trade contact, and because, as she told Adela when they met in the counting room, she had spent 3 years waiting for someone to tell her that what happened to her property was not an isolated incident of bad luck, but a practiced method with a name attached to it. She was 44 years old, and had the direct hurried quality of a woman who had said difficult things in difficult rooms before, and had learned that the saying of them was survivable. She brought her original competency hearing transcript, 3 years of correspondence she had preserved against all advice, and a name. A Boston attorney named Farlow, who had handled the paperwork on the Providence transfer. The same Farlow, she noted, whose name appeared in the margin of the Meridian letter Adela had found in the mill office. They sat in her father's counting room, and Adela listened for 2 hours without interruption, asking questions only when a date needed clarification or a figure needed context. The way Wendell Holbrook had taught her to listen to testimony, not to confirm what she already believed, but to find what she hadn't known to look for. Hadley took Dulcie's account the following morning and added it to the formal complaint he had already drafted for the county court. The complaint named Lionel and Farlow. It cited the Meridian letter, Reston's signed statement, the valuation discrepancy, and the competency petition language as evidence of premeditated fraud in a property transfer scheme. "He's done this before," Adela said, when Hadley summarized the Providence case's similarities. "Almost certainly more than once," Hadley said. "The Farlow connection suggests a legal infrastructure built for repetition, not a single incident." "Then the complaint needs to say that." It did. Reston testified voluntarily. He sat in the county attorney's office and gave a complete account without softening the parts that reflected badly on his own judgment, which Adela had asked him to do, and which he did with the exhausted precision of a man who understood that the only remaining asset he had was his credibility. He was not a good man, exactly. He had known enough to feel uneasy and had not acted on the unease for long enough that the distinction mattered. But he was honest now, in the specific, costly way that people become honest when the alternative is worse. Adela did not thank him warmly. She thanked him accurately. Lionel was located at the rail station in Concord, making inquiries about connections to New York, with a leather case that contained, among other things, a draft transfer deed that had not yet been filed. The county sheriff brought him back. He came without incident, which she had expected. Lionel was not the kind of man who made scenes he could not control. The legal proceedings took 4 months. They were not dramatic. They were careful and specific and comprehensive in the way that proceedings become when the documentation is thorough. The witnesses are credible, and the attorney on the other side is increasingly convinced his client had made an error of significant proportions. Adela attended the first hearing, the fourth, and the final one. She ran the mill in between. She hired 2 additional workers for the accounts office. One who had come up through the weaving floor and knew the machinery schedules from the inside out, and one who had trained under a Boston trade attorney and understood contracts better than anyone Adela had met. She trained them herself, with patience and specificity, the way her father had trained her. She increased the mill's north contracts by negotiating directly with the wool suppliers in Vermont, cutting out the middlemen Lionel had insisted on as necessary infrastructure. They were not necessary. They were his infrastructure. She removed them. Dulcie March returned to Providence in the spring, with the formal acknowledgement from the county court that her own case would be reviewed under the new precedent established by the Holbrook Moorefield proceeding. It was not a guarantee of recovery. It was a beginning. Adela wrote to her every month after that, practical letters, specific letters, the kind that contained information rather than comfort, because Dulcie was the kind of woman who found information more useful than comfort, and Adela understood that about her from their first conversation. On the day the final verdict came in, fraud and conspiracy, on all primary counts, against Lionel and Farlow. Adela was in the counting room going over the December weaving contracts. Purvis brought the news. He stood in the doorway with the court document in hand, and said nothing for a moment, because he was 61 years old, and had known Adela Holbrook since she was 9, and this was the kind of moment that didn't need speech. She set down her pen. She read the document through once, the way she read anything important, not for feeling, but for fact. "The mill's clear," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And the north contracts?" "Renewal signed, all 4 growers." She nodded. She picked up her pen. "Mrs. Moorefield," Purvis said. She looked up. "Your father knew." He said it carefully, the way he said things he had been holding for a long time. Not about Lionel specifically. But he knew there would be something, some attempt. He said to me once, this was maybe a year before he died, he said, "Adela will handle it. Whatever it is. She's built for this kind of weather." Adela was quiet for a moment. "He should have told me directly," she said. "Yes," Purvis agreed. "He should have. He worried about frightening you, before there was something specific to be frightened about." She thought about that. About the counting room, and the floor panel, and the words, "I hope you never need this." About 4 years of marriage, to a man who had been planning this from somewhere before the beginning, who had sat across from her at dinner, and smiled, and had the specific patience of someone waiting for the right moment to do what he had always intended to do. She had not loved Lionel. The grief of that was different from what it might have been. Not the loss of something that had existed, but the confirmation that something had never been real. That was its own particular hollowness. She acknowledged it, because she believed in honesty, even when it was only to herself, and then she set it down. It was not the largest thing she was carrying. It was not the thing that would last. The mill was hers, the ledgers were hers. The name on the North contracts was Holbrook, as it had been for 2 generations, and she intended it to remain so for the generation after that. Not because she was her father's continuation, but because she was her own beginning, and she had chosen this with full knowledge of what it cost and what it gave. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Outside, the December light moved across the mill yard, in the way winter light moved through Massachusetts. Thin and clear and entirely without apology. The looms were running. The wool was moving through the frames. The accounts were accurate to the dollar. Adela Moorefield had a stack of correspondence on the left side of the desk, and a clean ledger page on the right, and 3 more hours before the counting room went dark. She had everything she needed.